My wife left me for a billionaire. She said I'd never be able to give her the life she wanted. I didn't stop her. I just let her walk away. 8 months later, someone knocked on my door at midnight. When I opened it, my wife was standing there with tears in her eyes. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. James Calloway woke every morning at 5:30. Not because an alarm told him to. Not because the sun demanded it. He woke because his body had been trained by years of cold mountain mornings and early job sites, and because somewhere in the back of his mind there was always something waiting to be built. He moved through the dark house quietly. The floorboards knew where he stepped, and he knew where they creaked. He pulled on his flannel shirt, the blue one with the frayed second button he had never gotten around to replacing, and walked to the kitchen without turning on the hall light. The coffee maker was already set from the night before. He pressed the button, listened to it hiss and gurgle to life, and stood at the window with his arms crossed while the sky above the pine trees shifted from black to deep gray. Cedar Ridge was that kind of town. The kind where morning came slowly and the cold held on until it was good and ready to let go. In October, the frost settled overnight on the truck windshields, and the lake at the edge of town turned so still and flat it looked like hammered tin. In summer, the tourists came for the cabins and the hiking trails and the fishing. James built things for most of them. Additions, decks, full lake houses that started as blueprints on a folding table and ended up as someone's dream property after 6 months of careful, hard work. He poured his coffee and carried it to the front porch. The wood under his boots was smooth, and even because he had laid every plank himself, choosing the boards by hand, rejecting the ones that had too much knot or too much give. The railing was tight and sealed and perfectly square because he had set it that way, and because in his line of work there was no version of almost right that he could live with. He stood there in the cold and drank his coffee and looked at the pine trees across the road. And for most of his adult life, that simple routine had been enough. He and Hazel had been married for 12 years. They had met when he was 24, working 2 jobs and saving money he didn't yet have a plan for. She was 22 and studying marketing at Cedar Ridge Community College, taking the bus 3 mornings a week because she couldn't afford a car. They met at a diner on Elm Street where James ate breakfast and read over his job notes before the day started. He went there because it was cheap and filling, and the owner let him sit for an hour without bothering him. Hazel had been sitting across from him reading a textbook, the kind with bright chapter dividers and handwritten margin notes, and she had looked up and asked him what he was drawing on his napkin. He told her it was a roof truss design. She laughed, not unkindly, and said she didn't know what that was. He explained it to her, the way the angles worked, how the triangular geometry distributed weight, why the design mattered for a mountain roof under snow load. She listened with her chin in her hand and her coffee getting cold, and she asked questions that were genuinely curious. He explained it all to her. They talked for 2 hours. He left his breakfast half finished. They dated for a year. She finished her degree and got a part-time position at a small marketing firm in town. He started his own company, Callaway Ridge Construction, with a second-hand truck, a basic set of tools, and a business registration that cost him $240 at the county clerk's office. They were careful with every dollar. She kept the books on a paper ledger she bought at the office supply store. He managed every job himself, learning what he didn't know by doing it wrong first and then doing it right. They got married on a Saturday in June in the backyard of her mother's house. 30 guests, a cake her aunt baked in a sheet pan. James wore a borrowed suit that was slightly too long in the sleeves. Hazel wore a white dress she had sewn herself from a pattern she found at the fabric store, and she stood in her mother's backyard in that dress and said her vows and looked at James with an openness he had never seen on another person's face, like she was saying it and meaning every syllable of it at the exact same time. They rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery on Cedar Street. The smell of cinnamon rolls came through the floor every morning. It was not a large apartment. A single window in the main room, a bathroom with a loose towel bar that James fixed the first week, a kitchen where 2 people couldn't stand at the counter at the same time without turning sideways. They ate cheap pasta 3 nights a week and tracked every purchase in a small notebook. Hazel worked part-time at the marketing firm and helped with the business bookkeeping on evenings. James worked 12-hour days and was too tired most nights to do anything after dinner except sit on the couch and talk. Those were the years he still thought about sometimes late in the evening on the porch. Not with sentimentality, exactly, just with a clear, factual awareness that those years had been real and good, and that what they had between them in that apartment above the bakery had been genuine. When everything else fell apart later, he was never able to pretend it had been hollow from the start. It hadn't been. Something real had existed, and then something real had changed, and he had watched it change without being able to stop it. She used to say, lying in bed with the window cracked and the town quiet below them, "One day we'll have a house near the lake." And he had heard that as a promise he needed to keep. It took him 9 years. He built the company from solo operation to a crew of 7. 2 carpenters, a framer, an electrician on contract, and 3 general laborers he could count on to show up and work hard. He expanded the client list from basic repairs and additions to full custom builds. He landed his first major lake house project in year 4 and his second in year 6. And by year 8, he had enough of a reputation in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding mountain counties that good referrals came in without him having chased them. He built their house on Birchwood Drive in his 7th and 8th years of business. He chose the lot himself, a half-acre parcel on the south side of a ridge with a view of the pines and a walking distance to the lake. He poured the foundation in October of that 7th year, worked the framing through the winter, and finished the structure the following summer. He insulated every wall himself. He installed the kitchen cabinets he had designed on graph paper, measuring the space so carefully that every drawer opened without catching. He built the bookshelves in the living room from reclaimed barn, what he had sourced from a demolition job in the valley. He laid the stone fireplace using river rock he had pulled from the East Creek bed on weekends. Hazel painted the front door red. He had stood back and looked at that red door and felt something close to complete. But somewhere along the way, something in her had changed. James was not certain when it started. It crept in the way cold water got into a foundation, invisible and slow, then suddenly unavoidable. It had something to do with the phone. She had always used it, but the quality of her attention shifted over time. She started following accounts that showed other people's lives as something to aspire to. Women in large, bright apartments. Couples on beaches that didn't look like any beach near Cedar Ridge. Restaurants that cost more for one dinner than James spent on groceries in 2 weeks. She started making comments. The kitchen was small. The neighborhood was quiet in a tone that wasn't a compliment. Their vacations were too simple. Their social circle was too ordinary. James noticed. He was not the type to say much about it out loud. He watched it happen the way he watched weather systems roll over the mountains, with a kind of patient, pragmatic attention, noting the signs and adjusting as best he could. Some nights, she was completely fine. She laughed at the same things she had always laughed at, and they sat on the porch and drank beer and talked about nothing in particular, and it felt like they were still themselves. But those nights got further apart, and the other nights, the restless, scrolling, dissatisfied ones, filled in the space between them. He tried. He took her to Denver for a weekend and let her choose the restaurant. He came home from a 2-week cabin project and cooked the pasta she liked, the one with the lemon cream sauce she had made for their first apartment anniversary. He asked how her work was going. He told her he was proud of what she had built at the marketing firm. He was not performing attention. He genuinely cared how her days went. But the gap kept widening, and at some point he had to accept that he could not bridge it from his side alone. He told himself it was just a phase. He told himself that more than once. But there was a part of him, the part that had spent 15 years reading structural problems in wood and concrete and knowing when something was compromised before it showed any external sign, that didn't believe it. That part watched and noted and waited for what came next. The part that hurt most when he allowed himself to sit with it in the dark of the workshop or the early morning quiet of the porch was not the distance. People went through distance. Marriages had cold seasons. He had never expected it to be easy every year for the rest of his life, and he had never needed it to be. What hurt was that she had stopped seeing what they had built as something real. He had given her the house she asked for, not a version of it, not a compromise, but the actual thing built by his own hands on land he had chosen and purchased. He had given her 12 years of showing up, of being present, of taking care of everything that needed to be taken care of. And none of it counted against the image on her phone of a life that looked different. He understood that he couldn't fight an image. You couldn't argue with a feeling a person had about their own inadequacy. You couldn't build your way out of someone else's belief that what existed wasn't enough. He had learned this slowly and then all at once, the way you learn most true things. He told himself it was just a phase. He told himself that more than once. The man's name was Andrew Langford. James first heard the name from his foreman, Darren, who mentioned it one afternoon in September while they were eating lunch on a job site by the lake. A wealthy real estate investor from California had been buying up vacation properties around Cedar Ridge. 3 lakeside lots, 2 existing cabins, and a half-finished development on the North Ridge that a previous investor had abandoned when the permits got complicated. Andrew Langford drove a black sports car that was completely wrong for mountain roads. Threw parties on weekends loud enough that the East Lake Shore could hear them. James didn't think much about it. There were investors cycling through Cedar Ridge every season. They bought properties, renovated them, rented them out or sold them, and moved on to the next place. It was part of what kept his business running. He made a mental note of the name the way he noted any new player in the local property market, and then set it aside. He first saw Andrew at the hardware store in early October. The man was leaning against the service counter with the ease of someone who had never once stood in line. Tall, good-looking in an obvious way, the kind of good-looking that came from genetics and money and had been confirmed by other people's reactions his entire life. He was on the phone, talking loudly about a deal in Phoenix, gesturing at something only he could see, waving away the store clerk who was trying to help him without looking at the clerk. He drove away in the black sports car without buying anything. James loaded his lumber order and didn't give the man a second thought. It was Hazel who brought Andrew into their lives. There was a charity fundraiser at the Lakeside Grill in mid-October. A school renovation fund. New windows for the elementary school's east wing, which had been drafty for 3 winters. Hazel had volunteered with the school board event committee and was working the registration table at the door. James was supposed to meet her there after wrapping up a job site issue, but the issue turned into 3 hours on the phone with a window supplier who had shipped the wrong frames for the Crestwood project. By the time James arrived, the evening was well underway. He found Hazel near the bar. She was talking to Andrew Langford. James saw it before anything else registered, the way she was standing. Her posture had changed. Her shoulders were back, her chin slightly raised. She was laughing at something in a way she hadn't laughed with James in months, freely, with her whole face. When James came over, she made the introduction, and Andrew shook his hand with the practiced, measuring grip of a man who assessed people quickly and never let them see the result. James builds half the lake houses in this county, Hazel said. Again that tone. Not wrong, but performing, explaining him to Andrew rather than introducing him. Good work to being up here, Andrew said, already looking past James towards someone across the room. James stayed for an hour. He drank water, shook hands with people he knew, made the rounds the way you did at these things in a small town. When it was time to leave, he touched Hazel's elbow, and she said she was staying a little longer, that there were friends she hadn't seen in months. He nodded and drove home. He parked in the driveway, sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, and looked at the red front door in the porch light. He went inside. He made himself a sandwich. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and felt the first real weight of something he couldn't yet name pressing on the ceiling of the room. The late nights started in November. Not every night, but often enough. She came home after 10, sometimes after 11, always with explanations delivered in a steady, composed voice. A work meeting that ran late, though her job at the marketing firm didn't typically require evening hours. A college friend passing through Cedar Ridge for one night. A networking event at the Lakeside Grill, the same venue 3 times in 3 weeks. James wrote none of this down. He kept it in his head, which was how he worked best. He tracked it the way he tracked job site problems, without drama, without jumping ahead of the evidence, but with complete attention to what was actually happening. He noticed she started charging things on a joint account in the evenings at restaurants he didn't recognize. He noticed she had a new jacket he hadn't seen before. He noticed she put her phone face down on the table when she was home, which she had never done before. One Saturday evening in late November, they were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. The dishes were still on the counter. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down through the dark. James sat with his hand around his coffee mug and looked at the table for a moment, and then looked at her. "Are you seeing someone?" he asked. He kept his voice completely flat. No accusation in it. Just a question, offered the way he offered every question. Directly, because he had found in his life that directness saved time and preserved respect. Hazel looked at him. Her hands were wrapped around her own mug. She looked at him steadily, without looking away, and without any of the scramble or deflection he might have expected. "Yes," she said. The honesty hit harder than any lie could have. A lie would have given him something to push back against, some version of events to dispute. This was a fact, delivered without apology or decoration or any visible discomfort, and it settled into the kitchen between them like a beam going into place. Solid, final, load-bearing. James sat with it. Outside, the snow fell on the porch railing and on the pine trees across the road. "Andrew Langford," he said. Not a question. She nodded once. He stood up. He carried his mug to the sink. He rinsed it carefully, the way he always did. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. He didn't sleep until well past 2. The conversation that ended their marriage happened on a Sunday afternoon in December, 17 days after the kitchen table. James had given her those days. He had gone to work and come home and moved through the house with a deliberate, controlled calm that required more effort each day, but never cracked. He had spent those 17 days getting very clear inside himself. Not about what he felt, but about what was going to happen and how he intended to handle it. He had also spent some of them on the phone with Philip Ward. When he came home that Sunday, he found 2 suitcases in the front hallway. Packed, zipped, standing upright on the hardwood, like they had been there all along, like they belonged there. Hazel was in the living room near the window in her coat. She was not crying. Her face was composed and set, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had only been waiting for the moment to act on it. "I deserve more than this town," she said. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. James stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room. He looked at the suitcases, then at her. "What exactly is wrong with this life?" She turned away from the window. "You build houses for rich people, James. You'll never be one of them." He had heard things like that before in the amplified heat of arguments that got walked back by morning. But this was different. She was not arguing. She was stating something she believed to be simple, obvious, and final, the way you stated a fact that had been true for a long time and was only now being said out loud. "I've given you everything I said I would," he said. "You gave me this." She said it without cruelty or venom, which was almost worse than cruelty would have been. She said it the way you might explain a simple truth to someone who already knows it, but keeps pretending they don't. Her voice was patient, almost gentle. She didn't need to win this conversation. She had already won the one she was actually having, the one in her own head, months ago. From outside came the sound of an engine idling. James walked to the window without looking at her. The black sports car sat at the curb. Andrew Langford was behind the wheel. He had one arm on the door, and he was looking at his phone, not watching the house, not waiting anxiously, just waiting the way someone waited for a car wash to finish. James looked at the car for a long moment. He looked at the snow on the porch railing. He looked at the pine trees along the road that he had planted as seedlings the spring after they moved in. They were 15 feet tall now. He heard Hazel pick up one of the suitcases in the hallway. She paused at the door. He could feel her pause, the slight stillness of someone choosing their last words. She turned back, just briefly. "He can give me everything you never could." James looked at the pine trees. Then go. The door opened. The cold came in for a moment. The door closed. He heard the trunk of the car open and close, once, twice. He heard the engine pull away from the curb. And then the house was quiet. Not an ordinary quiet, a different kind entirely. The silence that filled a space after something was removed from it. Not empty, exactly, but rearranged in a way that hadn't settled yet. He stood at the window for a while. Then he went to his workshop in the garage, turned on the radio to a station playing something instrumental, and started finishing the porch trim repair he had been putting off for 3 weeks. He worked steadily, measuring twice and cutting once the way he always did, and the hours passed. The 17 days between the kitchen table conversation and the Sunday with the suitcases were the quietest of James's adult life. He worked them through the way he worked through every difficult problem, by not running from it and not rushing it, but by sitting with it until he understood its actual dimensions. He had loved Hazel. That was a true thing, and he wasn't going to spend time pretending it wasn't. He had loved her in the way that built slowly and held firm, not the loud, consuming way that burned itself out, but the steady, reliable way that showed up every morning and kept its promises over years. He had given her everything he said he would give her. He had built the house she asked for and built the company he needed to keep it. He had been present, provided for, and true. None of that was going to change what was happening. And he knew, in those 17 quiet days, that fighting what was happening would not bring back what they had been, that had already been gone for a long time. What was left now was the practical work of managing what came next, and James was exceptionally good at practical work. He called Philip Ward on the 3rd day. He explained the situation plainly, the way he explained everything. He told Philip about the trust, about the business registration, about the documentation he had. Philip listened without interrupting. When James finished, Philip asked 3 questions. James answered each one. There was a pause. "All right," Philip said. "When she files, call me." James thanked him and hung up. He went back to work. In the weeks after Hazel left, James worked. Not as escape or distraction. That was not how he was made. He worked because the work was real and because right now, real things were worth more to him than anything else. He was on job sites by 7 every morning, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had made his peace with what happened and was focused entirely on what came next. The Crestwood Lake House project was in its final construction phase, the largest single job Callaway Ridge Construction had ever taken on, and it required his complete attention. The Crestwood build was a 2-story custom home on the North Lake Shore. 3,000 square feet of handmade finish work, hand-set stone on the main floor, custom millwork on the stair rail, a wraparound deck that required 17 precisely mitered corner joints. His crew was solid. Darren had been his foreman for 5 years and knew how to read a job site the way James did. But James stayed late most evenings anyway, walking the framing with a flashlight after the crew had gone, checking measurements, reviewing the work list for the following morning. The cold didn't bother him. It never had. There was something clarifying about working in the cold. The mind simplified. You focused on what was in front of you, the measurement in your hand, the joint that needed setting, the sound the wood made when it seated correctly. Everything else fell back. The conversations you replayed, the things you wished you had said differently, the slow unwinding of a 12-year marriage that you had watched happen while standing close enough to touch it and too far away, in some fundamental sense, to stop it. All of that fell back when the hands were busy and the work was real. He thought about his father sometimes out on the cold job sites. His father had been a carpenter before he was anything else, a man who built furniture and fixed houses and believed that work done with care was its own argument for a life well spent. He had taught James how to hold a hammer, so the wrist did the work, not the shoulder. How to read the grain of a board before you committed to a cut. How to measure twice, so you only had to cut once. And how to document everything. That last lesson had been the most valuable, though James had not fully understood why until he sat in Philip Ward's office with a folder of papers and watched Philip's expression change as he read through them. His father had been the kind of man who prepared for things that hadn't happened yet. Not out of fear, out of respect for the future. You didn't leave important things unprotected because you were too comfortable or too trusting to imagine that they might need protection. You put the property in the trust. You kept the registration dated before the marriage. You kept the paperwork clean and organized because someday someone might need to read it, and when that day came, what you had prepared would speak for you. James drove home in the dark of those winter evenings and was grateful for his father every single time. Not with bitterness, because bitterness was a slow leak, It cost you energy and gained you nothing. He thought about her with a kind of calm, factual accounting. She had looked at her life and decided it wasn't enough. She had found a man she believed would give her the version of life she wanted. She had made a choice. He was not going to punish her for making it, and he was not going to pretend it hadn't happened. Both of those responses were forms of not accepting reality, and James had built his entire life on accepting things as they actually were. What he did allow himself to wonder about on those dark drives home was whether Andrew Langford was what Hazel expected him to be. He had seen enough wealthy people in his years of building their houses to know that money did not simplify a person. It did the opposite. It amplified whatever was already there, removed the obstacles that usually taught people patience and accountability, and turned every whim into an option. He wondered whether Hazel had thought any of that through, or whether she had been so fixed on the image she had built of Andrew's life that she had never looked past the surface of it. He filed for divorce in January. He drove to Philip Ward's office on a gray Tuesday morning, sat across the desk, and laid out the situation plainly. He had been thorough with the documentation, bank records, the LLC registration from 13 months before the marriage, the family trust paperwork, the property deed history. Philip was a careful, experienced attorney who had been practicing in the mountain counties for 20 years. He went through everything slowly, asked precise questions, and told James they were in a solid position. "She may file against you," Philip said. "I expect she will," James said. He said it without hardness, just as one more fact in the accounting. Andrew Langford's world was built to impress, and it succeeded. The mansion above the East Lake was everything the word implied. 3 floors of glass and stone built into the hillside, with a view of the water from every room on the east side, a boathouse, a wine cellar that occupied the entire lower level, and a kitchen with more counter space than Hazel's old marketing office had floor space. Andrew had a housekeeper who came 3 mornings a week and a property manager who handled the other Cedar Ridge buildings. He had accounts at the best restaurants in Denver and a standing reservation at a hotel in San Francisco that he used several times a year for business. For the first several weeks, Hazel told herself she had made the right decision. She told herself this with the particular insistence of a person trying to make a feeling keep pace with a belief. The feeling of rightness she had expected, that warm, confirming sense of finally arriving somewhere, hadn't quite materialized yet. But the circumstances were right. The house was beautiful. The clothes Andrew bought her were better than anything she had ever owned. She was living inside the image she had spent years scrolling past on her phone, and she held on to that. But Andrew Langford was the kind of man who had never been required to develop the patience or consideration that came from ordinary difficulty. When you could buy your way out of discomfort, you never built the tolerance for it. When you could replace whatever stopped working, you never learned how to repair it. The version of Andrew that had charmed her at the charity event, attentive, warm, specific in his interest, was the version he presented when he wanted something. Once he had what he wanted, the charm didn't disappear. It just stopped being directed at her. He was often on his phone. He had calls at odd hours, deals in multiple cities, people he needed to speak with right now, no matter what else was happening in the room. He came and went without explanation. 3 days in Denver, a week in Los Angeles, a long weekend somewhere she wasn't invited. He introduced her to his friends as Hazel without any further context, and she noticed that his friends never asked follow-up questions the way people did when someone genuinely mattered. She started to feel it around the 6-week mark. A low, quiet sense that something was misaligned. She pushed it down. She told herself that wealthy men lived differently, that he had obligations she didn't fully understand yet. She told herself that when his schedule settled, he was always implying his schedule was about to settle. He would be more present. She went to the gym. She explored Cedar Ridge's small downtown in a way she never had when she lived there as a regular resident. She kept herself busy during the long days when Andrew was gone. The social world that surrounded Andrew was the one that stung her most consistently. His circle was wealthy, connected, and composed of people who had known each other for years across multiple cities. They gathered at the mansion on weekends, drove up from Denver or down from Aspen, filled the lakeside deck with wine, and conversation that moved quickly from property deals to international travel to gossip about people Hazel had never met. She circulated among them with a smile she held carefully in place. She contributed to conversations when she could find the entry point, asked questions she thought were reasonable, made references to her marketing experience. But the conversations moved on without her the way rivers moved around rocks. Not hostile, just directed elsewhere. She was not part of the tissue that held these people together, and no amount of effort on her part was going to change that in an evening, or a month of evenings. She overheard Andrew describe her to a friend from Los Angeles as someone I met locally. 3 words. The specific casualness of it took the air out of her chest. She said nothing. She refilled her wine glass and kept smiling. The control was subtle at first. His opinion about where they ate was always the deciding one, so decisively expressed that she found herself agreeing before she had finished forming her own preference. His view on how she spent her evenings was framed as suggestion, but functioned as instruction. When she mentioned driving to Denver to spend a weekend with a college friend, he told her the timing wasn't right without explaining why, and she stayed home. When she asked about opening a personal bank account, not to challenge him, simply because she was beginning to feel the discomfort of having no financial autonomy at all, he looked at her with the expression of a man who found the question slightly embarrassing on her behalf. "What do you need your own account for?" he said. "Everything here is taken care of." She didn't press it. The days had a rhythm, but not a life. She woke, ate, existed in the beautiful house, and waited for Andrew to have time for her. She was starting to understand, piece by piece, that she wasn't in a relationship. She was an arrangement. He was the organizing principle, and she was an element of his household. No different in practice from the housekeeper or the property manager, except that she occupied a different role and had no salary. She lay awake some nights in the large bedroom with a lake view and ran the quiet inventory of what she had actually gained. A house that wasn't hers. Access to money that wasn't hers. A man who wanted her present, but not necessarily heard. And what she had traded. A husband who knew every board and nail in the home he had built with his own hands, who came home every day and sat at the table and asked how her work was going and actually waited for the answer. She did not say this to anyone. She got up and made coffee in the large kitchen and kept moving. 1 week before she finally asked Andrew the question she had been avoiding, she found something that removed any remaining uncertainty about where she stood. She had been looking for a laptop charger and picked up Andrew's phone by mistake. It was unlocked. She looked at the screen for a moment before understanding what she was looking at. The messages were from a woman named Portia from Miami. They were warm in the particular way that only came from a long, close history, full of specific references and private language that couldn't be invented. They stretched back 18 months. Hazel set the phone on the kitchen counter. She stood there in the large, expensive kitchen in the large, expensive house and thought about all the time she had spent here adjusting herself, fitting into the available space, keeping her voice at the right pitch and her face at the right expression and her needs at a manageable size so they wouldn't be inconvenient. She had done all of that, and this was what had existed beneath it the entire time. She thought about James. The thought arrived without her inviting it, quietly and without dramatics. She thought about the kitchen table at Birchwood Drive and the way he used to sit across from her after dinner with his coffee and ask how her day had gone. She had found that ordinary at the time. She had decided that ordinary wasn't enough. Now she stood in a kitchen that was 10 times the size of James's and felt the specific, precise quality of what ordinary could mean when it was given freely and kept without condition. She stopped that thought. She put the phone back where she had found it. A week later, she asked him when they were getting married. 6 months in, on a Tuesday evening in late April, Hazel came into the living room and sat across from Andrew and asked the question she had been building toward for weeks. "When are we getting married?" He looked up from his tablet. Not startled, not alarmed. He looked at her with the particular patience of a man adjusting his focus from something more important to something he was about to dispose of. "Married," he said. "Yes." She kept her voice level. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she pressed them together to keep them still. "You said we had a future. When I left, you were talking about what we could build together. He set the tablet on the cushion beside him. He leaned back. The pause was long enough to be deliberate, long enough that by the time he spoke, she already knew the answer. Hazel. He said her name like a title. Patient. Just slightly tired. I never said I wanted to get married. You talked about the future. I said I cared about you. He gave her a look that was almost kind in its certainty. That's not a proposal. Her stomach hollowed out. Not sharply, slowly like air leaving a tire. I left my husband for you, she said. Andrew looked at her for a moment. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. That was your choice to make, he said. I didn't ask you to leave anyone. The argument lasted less than 20 minutes. She raised her voice. He kept his even. She said things about what he had implied, what she had understood, what any reasonable person would have concluded from how he had acted. He said things about his own very clear sense of what he had and hadn't committed to. By the end of it, he had stood and told her, with the practiced calm of a man who had done this before, that she should pack. You're serious, she said. I'm flying to Spain at the end of the week. He picked up his phone. With a friend. With her, Hazel said. You should pack, he said again. She stood in the living room while he walked toward the stairs. She looked around at the house. The art, the stone floors, the lake visible through the west windows, darkening under the April sky. She looked at all of it and understood that she had no claim on any of it. She had never had a claim on any of it. She had been living inside something that was his in every dimension and had never, at any point, been theirs. The next morning her bags were on the driveway. The security gate at the foot of the hill closed behind her with a smooth, electric click that was somehow the most indifferent sound she had ever heard. She stood on the road outside the gate with her 2 suitcases and a phone with 31% battery. The morning was cool, and the lake at the bottom of the hill was bright in the early light, and Cedar Ridge was going about its business in every direction. She called a cab. She did not know where she was going. The town did not change while Hazel was gone. Cedar Ridge moved through its seasons with the indifference of mountain geography, unchanged by the private dramas of anyone living in it. The summer came. The tourists arrived with their kayaks and their hiking boots and their reservations at the lakeside restaurants. James's crew finished the Crestwood Lake House in late July. When the client did the final walkthrough, he moved through each room in silence, touching the millwork and looking at the ceiling heights and checking the way the deck's corner joints had been set, and then he shook James's hand for a long time. 20 years I've been hiring contractors, he said. This is the finest house I've ever seen come out of the ground. James thanked him and meant it. The Crestwood job had taken everything he had, every technical skill he had spent 15 years developing, every management decision, every late evening with a flashlight walking the framing. It was the kind of work that a man could look at and know exactly what he had put into it. That kind of work left very little room for anything else, and James had been grateful for that, especially in the months when the alternative to focus was sitting in a quiet house thinking about what had happened. He bought a new truck in August, a heavy-duty work truck in dark gray, built for the mountain roads and the equipment loads he needed it to carry. He drove it home on a Saturday afternoon, parked it in the driveway, and stood back and looked at it the way he stood back from a finished project, with the simple satisfaction of having done something right. He had his house. He had his company, now with 8 crew members after a strong referral season had him staffing up. He had his mornings on the porch with the coffee and the cold air and the pines. He had Darren and the crew, men he trusted and had worked alongside long enough to know how they thought and what they were capable of. He had Cedar Ridge itself, the roads he had driven his whole life, the lake in every season, the particular quality of light in the mountains in September that he had never seen anywhere else. His sister called from Fort Collins every Sunday evening. She pushed him once, gently, about whether he was seeing anyone. He told her he was fine. She said she knew that wasn't an answer. He said he wasn't ready for that kind of attention yet, and that he knew himself well enough to know the difference between not ready and not ever. She accepted that. Philip Ward called in October to confirm that the divorce proceedings were moving forward and that he should expect contact from Hazel's attorney. James thanked him, asked if there was anything he needed to prepare, and wrote 3 items on the notepad by the kitchen phone. Tax returns, business registration documents, trust documentation. He pulled everything from the file cabinet that weekend, organized it chronologically, and made copies. The call from Hazel's attorney came 10 days later. The midnight knock came on a Friday in November. James had been in bed for about an hour, not deeply asleep. Fridays were always slow to release. The accumulated tension of managing crews and deadlines and subcontractors across 3 active job sites didn't dissolve the moment he pulled back the covers. He lay in the dark listening to the house settle in the cold and let his mind slow down. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. He lay still for a moment, placing the sound. Not the settling of the structure. Not the wind. Actual knocking, deliberate and heavy enough to be heard through a closed bedroom door. He pulled on his jeans and a sweatshirt and walked down the hallway. He turned on the porch light before he opened the door. Hazel stood on the step. She was wearing a thin jacket that was completely wrong for November at this elevation. Her hair was loose and damp and had dried wrong, half flat against one side of her face. Her cheeks were red from the cold. Her eyes were swollen in the particular way that came from crying over several hours rather than just a few minutes. She was carrying a single bag on her shoulder, not the 2-pack suitcases she had left with, just one bag, and it looked half empty. She was not the woman who had walked out of this house 8 months ago. That woman had been composed, resolved, facing forward with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was walking toward. The person on the porch step looked like the certainty had been worked out of her by time and circumstance, and what was left was something exhausted and stripped down. James looked at her. He kept his hand on the door frame. "James!" Her voice came out rough and small in the cold air. "Please." He stepped back and let her in, not from softness or forgiveness or any residual pull toward what they had once been, from the plain fact that it was below freezing and she was dressed for October. He turned on the lamp in the living room, went to the kitchen, and came back with a glass of water. He sat on a coffee table. She came in and stood in the middle of the living room. She looked around, at the bookshelves, at the fireplace, at the photograph on the side table that was still there, because James saw no reason to remove it. And then she pressed her hands against her face and started crying. Not quietly, the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and had been held back for a long time. James sat in the armchair. He waited. He didn't move toward the couch, didn't sit beside her, didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things had to finish before anything else could happen. He looked at his house while she cried. The lamp cast the room in the warm, amber light he had always liked. It came from a fixture he had installed himself, wired through the wall to a switch that sat at exactly the right height on the left side of the doorway. The River Rock fireplace was dark tonight, but clean. The barnwood bookshelves held the same books they had always held, arranged the same way, because he hadn't seen any reason to rearrange them. The room was exactly what it had been the day she left. He had not changed it, not because he was waiting for her, but because it was his room and it suited him and there was nothing in it that needed changing. He thought about what she had said when she packed those 2 suitcases, that he built houses for rich people, that he would never be one of them. He had heard it the first time and let it go because there was nothing in it worth arguing with. But sitting here now in his own room, with the good light and the solid walls and the stone fireplace he had laid by hand, he thought about the simple accuracy of his own life. He had built this. He had earned it, documented it, protected it, and maintained it. It was real in every way that something could be real. And it was his. When she could speak, she told him. Andrew had relocated to Europe. Spain initially, then Portugal, then apparently some arrangement between the two. He had been photographed at a charity event in Lisbon with Portia, and their photograph had made the rounds of a real estate networking site that Hazel had apparently been checking regularly. His Cedar Ridge properties were being managed remotely by a firm out of Denver. He had no visible plans to return. The promises, the future he had described in the early days, the words she had interpreted as commitment, were gone because they had never been what she thought they were. She could see that now with the painful clarity of full hindsight, the kind you could only achieve after walking all the way into something and out the other side. He had never made a promise. She had made one for him in her own mind and spent 8 months running toward it. She had no savings. She had been living entirely on his money and had accumulated nothing of her own because there had been no mechanism for it, and she hadn't pushed hard enough to create one. She had no job. She had resigned from a marketing firm with 2 days' notice and no plan, burning that bridge with the full confidence that she would never need it again. She had been staying in a budget motel on the edge of Cedar Ridge for 3 weeks, running down what remained on her credit card. She looked around the living room again, at the River Rock fireplace, at the barnwood bookshelves, at the door to the kitchen where the cabinets he had built from graph paper met the ceiling at a perfect line. "I made a terrible mistake," she said. Her voice was low and flat now, past the heavy crying. James looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. He stood. He brought the extra blanket from the hall closet and left it folded over the arm of the couch. He turned off the lamp on the far side of the room, leaving the one by the door on. He said goodnight and went back to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time. He thought about what the next weeks would require of him. The steadiness, the documentation, the deliberate calmness of a man who had prepared for this and was not going to be moved by it. He thought about Philip Ward and the filing and the courtroom. He thought about his father, who had set up the family trust years before he died, who had told James once that the most important thing you could do in business was document everything and protect the things you had built. He fell asleep sometime after 2. 2 weeks later, the court papers arrived. James was at the kitchen table with his coffee when the envelope came through the mail slot. He recognized the legal format of it, picked it up, and read it standing in the hallway. He sat on the table. He finished his coffee. He called Philip at 9. Hazel had filed for divorce and property division. Her claims were comprehensive. Half the marital home, a 40% stake in Callaway Ridge Construction, on the argument that the company had grown substantially during the marriage and that Hazel's domestic contribution had enabled that growth. Monthly financial support based on emotional neglect during the marriage. Her attorney is arguing that you prioritized work over the relationship, Philip said, that she was emotionally unsupported and that the marriage's breakdown was a result of your unavailability. James was quiet for a moment. Outside his kitchen window, the November sky was white and close to the ridge. "When is the hearing?" he asked. He prepared for the hearing the way he prepared for a complex build. Methodically, without shortcuts. He pulled every document Philip requested and several he hadn't thought to request. The original LLC registration dated February of the year before the marriage, the full trust documentation in his father's name, the property deed history, the construction loan application that was in his name alone, the bank statements showing the sources of funds used during the house construction. He organized them by category and date and brought them to Philip's office in a folder that was clearly labeled. Philip went through everything slowly. He looked up from the trust documents with an expression that said he was pleased but was trying not to be visibly pleased. "You set this property in the trust 3 years ago," Philip said. "My father's trust was established years before that," James said. "When I built the house, I put the property into it." He passed 4 years back. The trust rolled to me by the terms of his will. The property stayed in the trust, and Hazel was aware of this. We talked about it when I was handling the estate after my father died. I explained the trust structure to her at the time. She understood what it meant. Philip set the documents down and looked at the LLC registration date again. He tapped the corner of it. "The company was registered 13 months before your marriage." "Correct. She has no claim to the company." "No," James said. "She doesn't." Philip leaned back. "The house either." "No." There was a pause. "She has nothing," Philip said. James looked at the table. "Then let's make sure the hearing reflects that." The hearing was on a gray Tuesday morning in late November. James drove to the courthouse in Cedar Ridge before dawn, parked in the municipal lot, and sat in the truck for a moment. The mountains to the west were dark against a sky that was just starting to lighten. The first serious snow of the season was coming in. He could feel in the air through the truck's vent that particular sharpness that the mountains put out in the hours before a storm. He had lived here long enough to know exactly what it meant. He buttoned his jacket and went inside. The courtroom was small the way small-town courtrooms were, wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly drained, a judge's bench built in a style that suggested function over impression. James sat at the plaintiff's table with Philip. At the opposite table, Hazel sat with her attorney, a man named Burke who had come up from Colorado Springs and who carried himself with the particular authority of a lawyer who billed by fractions of the hour. James kept his gaze forward. He was aware of Hazel at the edge of his vision, but he did not look at her directly. He had nothing he needed to communicate to her by looking. Everything he had to say was in the folder on the table. Burke's opening argument was carefully built. He spoke about the arc of the marriage, about the years during which Callaway Ridge Construction had grown from a one-man operation to a seven-person company, about how that growth had been supported by a domestic partnership. He argued that Hazel had provided the household stability that allowed James to focus exclusively on his professional life. He spoke about the marital home with its 8 years of shared residence, about Hazel's emotional investment in the property, about the equity she was owed as a partner in the life that house had been built around. He spoke about emotional neglect with the practiced weight of someone who had used that term many times and knew exactly how to hold it in a sentence. Hazel sat at her table with her hands folded and her eyes occasionally moving toward the judge with an expression calibrated to convey measured pain. James had seen that expression before. He recognized its angles. When it was his turn, Philip walked him through the key facts with the efficiency of a lawyer who had spent years learning that brevity was its own form of authority. James answered each question clearly and without elaboration he hadn't been asked for. He had always spoken this way. Directness wasn't performance for him. It was just how he communicated. "Your Honor," Philip said, "my client's construction company was established as a single-member LLC in the February preceding the marriage by 13 months. The registration documents are before the court. The company's growth during the marriage reflects Mr. Callaway's documented business decisions and client relationships. Mrs. Callaway held no ownership stake, no officer position, and drew no salary from the company at any point. The domestic contribution argument has no legal basis in these circumstances." The judge made a note. "And the property?" he said. "The property on Birchwood Drive was placed into the Callaway Family Trust at the time of construction," Philip said. "The trust documents are in evidence. The property was held in the trust continuously from the date of the foundation permit through the present day. It was never transferred into marital property and never treated as joint asset by either party. Under Colorado property law, it falls outside the scope of marital division." Burke rose to challenge the trust argument. He raised the claim that marital funds had been used during the construction period, that Hazel had been an active domestic partner throughout the build, that the house could not be cleanly separated from the marriage it had been built within. Philip responded with the bank statements, the construction loan application, the draw schedule. The numbers were precise and unambiguous. The house had been built with James's premarital savings, a construction loan in his sole name, and business revenue from Callaway Ridge Construction, which itself predated the marriage. Burke pivoted to the emotional neglect argument. He described James as a man who had been absent from the marriage in practice, even when present in the house, consumed by his business, emotionally unavailable, the kind of partner who built things for other people and had nothing left over for the one person he had promised to take care of. James sat at the table and listened to this without moving. He thought about the pasta with the lemon cream sauce. He thought about the weekend in Denver and the questions about how her work was going and the thousands of small ordinary days he had shown up for. He thought about what it meant to be accused of absence by a woman who had chosen to be absent. He kept his hands flat on the table. The judge reviewed the documents. He was methodical, gray-haired, precise, asking questions that were specific enough to be useful and patient enough to not be rushed. He went back through the trust documents a second time. He asked Philip 2 clarifying questions about the construction loan structure. He asked Burke to walk him through the specific dates of the emotional neglect claims. Burke did. The judge wrote something down and looked at both tables. James was still. He breathed slowly. The ruling came clearly and without theater. The LLC registration predated the marriage by 13 months. Callaway Ridge Construction was James Callaway's sole property. Hazel's claim to any percentage of the company was denied. The Callaway Family Trust held the property on Birchwood Drive. The evidence showed no conversion of the property to marital status at any point. Hazel's claim to the house or its equity was denied. The argument for domestic contribution enabling business growth was not supported by the evidence presented. The claim for ongoing financial support was denied. Hazel was entitled to the divorce she had filed for. Nothing further. James heard each denial the way he heard a structural inspection come back clean. Without surprise, without visible relief, without any performance of satisfaction. He had done the work. He had organized the evidence. He had sat in a courtroom and let the facts speak in the way that facts, when properly gathered and properly presented, eventually did. Burke began to raise another challenge. The judge heard 3 sentences of it, and then raised one hand and spoke with the patient finality of someone who had sat in this courtroom for 20 years and knew exactly where a dead end was. The gavel came down. Hazel turned to Burke and said something James couldn't hear. Burke shook his head once, gathered his papers, and reached for his briefcase. Outside, the snow had started. It fell in small, thin flakes, the first light fall ahead of the main system, the kind that dusted the ground and clung to evergreen needles and made the courthouse steps look clean and white and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. James buttoned his jacket, shook Philip's hand on the steps, thanked him for the work, and accepted the promise of final paperwork by Friday. He was halfway down the path to the parking lot when he heard footsteps behind him. He stopped. He turned. Hazel stood at the top of the courthouse steps. Her attorney was gone. Burke had headed the other direction, already on his phone, already moving to the next thing. She stood there alone at the top of the steps in her coat, the snow falling around her, her arms crossed against the cold. She looked at James with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the composed certainty she had worn the day she left. Not the calculated injury of the courtroom. Something stripped all the way back, down to what was underneath when all the other things were removed. "I have nowhere to go," she said. Her voice was small in the open air. The snow fell between them. James stood on the path below the steps. He looked at her, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, not with any residual ache for what they had been. He looked at her the way you looked at the end of a difficult project, with the steady clarity of something that was now fully and finally complete. "You chose your future the day you walked out," he said. He meant it exactly as he said it. She had made a choice. She had made it clearly and deliberately and with full confidence, and the choice had run its course. That was the most honest thing he could give her, and he had always given what he actually had to give. He turned and walked to his truck. He drove out of the lot, through Cedar Ridge's downtown, past the hardware store where he bought his lumber, the diner on Elm Street where he had eaten breakfast and explained a roof truss to a woman reading a textbook 20 years ago, the elementary school with the new East Wing windows that his crew had helped make possible. The snow was coming down harder now. The ridge was in the clouds. He turned onto the Birchwood Drive road and climbed the hill. He pulled into his driveway. He sat with the engine off and the snow falling soft on the windshield. The porch light was on. The red front door glowed in it. He got out. He walked to the porch. He stood there for a moment before going inside, the way he always stood for a moment on the porch before going in. He listened to the pine trees. He looked at the snow settling on the railing he had built from straight-grained Douglas fir, sealed and tight against exactly this kind of winter. He went inside. He took off his boots. He hung his jacket. He walked to the kitchen and filled the kettle and set it on the burner. He stood at the window and looked at the snow falling on the backyard, on the workshop, on the trees he had planted, on the land that had been his father's trust and was now his. This house, the one she had called small, the one she had walked away from without looking back, the one he had framed in the cold of 2 winters, roofed in July heat, insulated by hand in October when he came home every evening covered in fiberglass dust. The one his father's trust had protected and the law had confirmed and no courtroom argument had been able to diminish. The house that was now, fully and completely, and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what it had always been. His. He made his tea. He carried it to the front porch. The snow fell steadily on the pine trees along the road. The town below was quiet. He could not see the lake from here in the dark and the snow, but he knew it was there, flat and gray under the storm, cold and deep, the same water it had always been. He had grown up watching that lake change through every season, and he had never gotten tired of it. He had built a life here that was genuinely his own. not borrowed from anyone's idea of what a man was supposed to want, not assembled from comparison or performance or the restless chase of something that looked better on screen. A life built from real work and real decisions on real ground. A life that had been tested by time, by distance, by loss, by a courtroom, and everything that led to it, and had held. Not because it was showy or remarkable, because it was true. He drank his tea. The snow fell on the porch railing. The house was quiet around him in a way that had no absence in it, no hollow in the walls. It was quiet the way a finished project was quiet, complete, solid, standing exactly as it should. James stood on his porch in the falling snow, breathing the cold mountain air, and felt the kind of peace that only came to a man who had built something with his own hands and protected it with clear eyes and a steady will. It was a quiet life, and it was everything.